Today, we're actually stepping into a really profound Christian sermon. And, we're looking at an event that most people probably have at least some mental image of.
Oh, definitely. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
Right. But here's the thing, when we usually picture that event, our minds immediately go to like the intense physical suffering, right?
Yeah, the visceral stuff. Or maybe those dramatic visible phenomena like, the Gospel of Matthew describes earthquakes shattering the ground and
And the temple curtain just like tearing violently in two.
exactly, the really cinematic details. It is so incredibly easy to get caught up in the physical trauma of that moment because, well, as human beings, that's just how we process reality.
Right. We react to what we can see and touch and feel.
Yeah, but the entire mission of today's sermon is to basically pull us out of that default setting.
Okay, so pulling us out how?
Well, the preacher is asking us to completely shift our perspective away from that ground level physical chaos and instead to adopt this top-down spiritual view.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, essentially we're being invited to look at this whole event through God's perspective of the unseen world.
I was thinking about this shift in perspective, and it actually reminds me of like looking at an architectural blueprint.
Oh, that's a good comparison. How so?
Well, if you look at a building's front elevation drawing, you just see the facade, right? The doors, the windows, the visible surface.
Right, the stuff you can literally walk up and touch.
Exactly. And that is how we usually look at life. We see the physical world, we see the pain, the struggle, the literal nails.
The immediate reality.
But what today's sermon is asking us to do is to look at the plan view, like the overhead top-down perspective that shows the hidden structural walls and the foundation.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. Because, if you only ever look at the front elevation, you don't actually know how the building stands up.
Right, you're missing the structural reality entirely.
Exactly. And in our daily lives, we are constantly trapped in that front elevation view. We're like obsessed with our physical problems or immediate visible
Well,
struggle.
totally. It's so easy to get stuck there.
But listening to today's sermon reveals that the ultimate structural victories over the things that truly paralyze us.
Like the fundamental fear of death.
Yes, exactly. Those victories actually take place entirely in that unseen structural reality.
Okay, so, how do we actually access that top-down blueprint? Because it's not like we can just flip a switch in our brains, right?
Right, it takes a bit of a roadmap.
Yeah. So to help us understand this unseen reality, the preacher focuses heavily on three very specific things Jesus said on the cross.
The statements recorded in the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah, exactly. And these aren't just, famous last words. They are essentially coordinates mapping out this unseen spiritual world.
I love that. They act as windows into what is actually happening behind the physical curtain.
Let's look at the first one. So, right after being nailed to the cross, the very first thing Jesus says is, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing."
It's an incredibly famous line.
It really is. And it's often quoted just to show how compassionate he was. But the preacher argues there's something far more radical happening here structurally.
And that starts with the very first word, right? The invocation of Father.
Yeah, which to a modern listener, calling God Father sounds completely standard.
Oh, absolutely. But in the historical context of the first century, the preacher emphasizes just how unprecedented and frankly scandalous this was.
Wait, scandalous?
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Throughout the entire history of the Old Testament, no single individual ever addressed God directly as Father in this intimate, personal way.
Wait, not even Moses or like David. Nobody.
Not a single one. God was viewed as the father of the nation of Israel collectively. But an individual claiming that direct, personal, parent-child relationship, completely unheard of.
So by saying this out loud in front of their religious leaders who had just condemned him for blasphemy.
Jesus was definitively establishing his unique position. He wasn't backing down at all. He was asserting his spiritual authority in the unseen realm, right in the middle of his physical execution.
Man, so it's a massive power dynamic shift, just hiding in plain sight.
Exactly.
And then, there's the second half of that statement, the forgive them part.
Right.
My initial thought is always that he's talking about the Roman soldiers, physically hammering the nails, or maybe the crowds mocking him.
Sure. That's the natural front elevation assumption.
But the sermon blows the scope of this way up.
It really does. Because if we are looking from the top-down blueprint view, this isn't just a localized pardon for a few soldiers.
What is it then?
Well, it is spoken in today's sermon as a blanket, cosmic amnesty for all of humanity, stretching all the way back to Adam.
Wow, all the way back.
Yeah, the physical act of the crucifixion is just the visible focal point, but the spiritual reality is a retroactive and proactive forgiveness that covers the entire human timeline.
Which naturally leads us right to the second statement, because if that door of cosmic forgiveness is open, someone has to walk through it, right?
Exactly. And that plays out literally right next to him.
Yeah. Jesus is hanging between two criminals who are enduring the exact same horrific physical reality, but their reactions are like polar opposites.
The contrast between those two men is just, I mean, it's one of the most revealing moments in the entire text regarding human nature.
It really is. One criminal demands a physical rescue. He essentially says, if you're the Messiah, prove it. Get us off these crosses.
Right. He is entirely locked into the front elevation view. He only cares about saving his biological flesh.
But the other criminal does something totally astounding. He somehow accesses that top-down view.
Yeah, he really does.
He looks past the blood and the wood, recognizes a spiritual king, and just asks, remember me when you come into your kingdom.
And Jesus' response to that is the second key statement. Today you will be with me in paradise.
Such a powerful promise.
It is. But now, think about what is not happening here. Jesus does not offer to save the man's physical body.
Right.
He doesn't say, today I will take us down from these crosses and heal our wounds. The physical death is still going to happen.
Yeah, the visible tragedy proceeds exactly as planned.
But the unseen reality is completely redefined. Jesus introduces this entirely new concept of paradise.
Which was huge because for a first-century person, the afterlife was often this murky, shadowy concept.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Jesus promises an immediate, eternal, spiritual existence. He guarantees that the man's core essence, his spirit, is completely secure.
Regardless of the fact that his body is minutes away from expiring.
Exactly. Which brings us to the climax, the final words before he dies.
Statement number 3. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.
Right. And this is the ultimate distillation of the entire sermon.
Yeah.
Because in his absolute final moment of consciousness, Jesus places zero focus on his battered flesh. The entirety of his focus, his absolute trust, is placed on his spirit and his connection to the Father.
I have to admit, it's easy to read that and just think, well, that's a beautifully poetic way to pass away.
Sure, it sounds nice on a surface level.
But the preacher insists this specific focus on the spirit was completely revolutionary. Why is that?
Well, think about the Roman centurion watching all of this.
Right, a hardened executioner who had probably seen hundreds of men die.
Exactly. And this specific moment moves him to suddenly praise God. Why? Because it fundamentally shifted the very definition of what salvation actually means.
Okay, break that down for me.
Up until that point, and frankly even today, human beings equate salvation with physical rescue.
Right. If we are sick, salvation is a cure.
If we are in danger, salvation is a literal escape route. We want our bodies saved.
Always back to the physical.
Yeah. But Jesus, by willingly committing his spirit while letting his body die, demonstrates that true rescue isn't about extending biological life for a few more decades.
It is about rescuing the eternal essence of a person.
Exactly.
Okay, I track with all of that. Intellectually, the idea of an eternal spiritual rescue sounds infinitely better than a temporary physical one.
Right on paper, it's a no-brainer.
But here's the friction. If this unseen spiritual reality is so magnificent, why do we constantly reject it?
Oh, man.
Like, why is it so incredibly hard for us to actually grasp?
That is the eternal human dilemma, isn't
Yeah.
it? We are so tethered to the physical world that the spiritual one feels abstract or, even foolish.
Right. And to explain why we do this, the preacher shared an anecdote in the sermon that I genuinely did not see coming.
Oh, yes. This story.
It is incredibly visceral, highly physical, and honestly a little bit funny, but it drives the point home perfectly.
You're talking about the physical struggles he experienced just prior to delivering the message.
Yes. It is a masterclass in using the physical body to explain the spiritual condition.
It really is.
Right, so the preacher enthusiastically recounts this absolute nightmare of a week he had. He developed severe toothaches in multiple teeth at once.
Ouch.
He said every time he tried to chew, it felt like nails were being driven into his jaw.
A very apt, albeit, painful parallel to the subject matter.
Seriously. So to cope, he had to completely stop chewing. He went on a strict liquid diet.
Right. Blended meals, super soft rice gruel, that sort of thing.
Everything just swallowed whole. But because he wasn't chewing, his mouth wasn't producing saliva.
Right, which throws off the whole system.
Exactly. The normal digestive mechanics of his body essentially shut down, which led to terrible, agonizing constipation.
Oh, wow.
He literally described spending an agonizing hour before church just struggling in the bathroom with severely hardened bowels.
I mean, it takes a lot of vulnerability to share a story like that from a pulpit.
Okay.
But he didn't share it just for shock value. The biological mechanism of what happened to him is a flawless metaphor for what happens to the human heart.
Okay, walk me through the connection there.
Well, when the preacher stopped the natural, intended process of breaking down his food, the chewing, the mixing with saliva, the system stalled out.
Right.
The materials that were supposed to nourish him stopped flowing naturally and became painfully hardened, creating a blockage.
And the preacher points out that our spiritual lives operate on a nearly identical mechanism,
Yeah.
so we get spiritually constipated.
Essentially, yes.
That's hilarious.
But true, we encounter truths about the unseen spiritual world, but instead of digesting them, our natural instinct is to reject them.
we say, I can't see that, so it can't be real.
Exactly. We stop the flow of spiritual intake. And as a result, our hearts become hardened toward anything beyond the physical. We develop a spiritual blockage.
And it's not just a modern skepticism problem, right? The preacher points out that even the people who physically saw the miracles struggled with this.
Absolutely. Look at Peter, James, and John, the inner circle of Jesus' disciples.
Right.
They saw the blind receive sight, they saw the dead raised, and yet, when Jesus tried to explain the unseen reality of his impending death and resurrection,
Their hearts were hardened.
they couldn't digest it. They wanted a physical, political king who would defeat the Romans, not a spiritual king who would die on a cross.
So if we all suffer from this hardened, blocked-up condition, what is the cure? How do we get the system flowing again?
Well, that is the stated goal of listening to today's sermon.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The preacher hopes that by continually exposing ourselves to these truths, the words will act as a sort of softening agent for our hardened hearts.
I love that, a softening agent.
By wrestling with these concepts, little by little, the hardness begins to break down, allowing the reality of the unseen world to finally flow naturally into our awareness.
Okay, let's assume the softening agent works. Our hearts soften, the blockage clears, and we can finally accept that this top-down, unseen reality exists. What do we actually see when we look at the blueprint? When Jesus committed his spirit and died physically, what was the actual result in that unseen world?
This is where the sermon dives deep into the profound theology running through the books of Isaiah, 1 Corinthians, and Hebrews.
Okay, break that down for me.
In the physical world, Jesus submitted to death. But in the unseen world, that absolute submission was met with an explosive, reality-altering victory from God.
What exactly did that victory accomplish? The sermon mentions a veil being destroyed.
Yes, referring to a prophecy in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah speaks of a heavy veil or a shroud that covers all the nations of the earth.
And that veil is a metaphor.
It's a metaphor for death. It's the ultimate suffocating boundary that no human being, no matter how powerful or wealthy, can ever escape.
Right. It's the one statistic that remains 100% for everyone.
Precisely. But it is spoken in today's sermon that at the exact moment Jesus committed his spirit, God completely obliterated that veil in the unseen realm. Death, as an absolute final boundary, was destroyed. And because that boundary was removed, a physical and spiritual resurrection becomes an inevitable reality for all humanity.
So the mechanics of the universe literally changed.
Yes.
And the sermon doesn't just stop at the concept of death, right? It goes after the source of it.
Right. It addresses the devil, the entity described as having the power of death, who introduced the lie of mortality back in the Garden of Eden.
And what happened to him?
The victory on the cross entirely stripped that entity of its power.
Okay, let me see if I can translate this into a modern context because it's so massive.
Go for it.
While the physical crowds were staring at what they thought was just a brutal state-sponsored execution, the unseen reality was essentially a massive legal and structural takedown.
Exactly.
It sounds almost like a cybersecurity scenario. Imagine a vicious computer virus that has infected a global network.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. The virus is the corruption of death and the devil's influence, spreading through the human system.
Right. And humanity has been trying to fight it from the front end, trying to delete infected files one by one, which never works.
Right, treating the symptoms.
But what Jesus did was give God the ultimate access to the system. And God, like the ultimate hacker or system admin, didn't just fight the symptoms.
No. He goes deeper.
He bypassed the front end entirely, went straight into the mainframe of the unseen world, and completely deleted the source code of the virus.
That is a remarkably accurate way to visualize it. The source code of death was permanently erased. The system is fundamentally clean, even if the residual effects are still temporarily showing up on our monitors.
That makes perfect sense.
And we know this action took place entirely in the system's back end, the spiritual realm, because of what the preacher points out from the book of 1 Peter.
What does Peter say?
Christ is described as going and preaching to the spirits in prison. The entire theater of this victory was unseen.
Okay, that is epic on a cosmic scale. But, I always want to bring it back to the ground level.
Yeah.
We've talked about ancient history. We've talked about massive theological source code deletions. But how does knowing about this unseen victory actually change the life of a normal person trying to get through a Tuesday in the year 2026?
That is the most important question of all. And the preacher answers it by sharing an intensely vulnerable piece of his own life story near the end of the sermon.
Yeah, that testimony was incredibly powerful. He confessed that for 23 years of his life, he lived in absolute paralyzing terror of death.
He was completely incapacitated by it. He suffered from vivid nightmares of being killed.
Just awful.
The fear was so heavy that he couldn't even function fully in normal society. He was living under that heavy veil of Isaiah, feeling its weight every single day.
But then 56 years ago, he experienced a profound shift.
He did.
He said a light led him to a church where he heard the exact truths we are discussing today. He heard that death had already been destroyed in the unseen world.
Right.
And he said an inner voice just clicked and told him, this is what you've been looking for.
He finally saw the structural blueprint. Now, if we apply that to you, the listener, it becomes incredibly practical.
How so?
We cannot deny the physical reality around us. The physical world is full of decay.
Right.
The preacher explicitly mentions massive catastrophic tragedies where tens of thousands of physical bodies were lost, like the Great Kanto earthquake or the Kobe earthquake.
Right. Acknowledging the spiritual reality doesn't mean we pretend the physical tragedies don't happen. Physical death is unavoidable.
Exactly. But the ultimate message of today's sermon is one of defiant, incredible hope.
Yes.
The physical body will eventually fail, whether through age, illness, or tragedy. But because the source code of death has been deleted, your spirit, the core essence of who you are, has been absolutely guaranteed eternal life in the Father's house.
It's guaranteed. Not maybe, not if you're lucky. Guaranteed.
And because of that guarantee, because the devil has been disarmed and the veil has been torn, you no longer have to live under the paralyzing shadow that tortured the preacher for 23 years.
That is amazing.
You are invited to step boldly before the Creator of the universe and call him Abba, Father, entirely free from the fear of ultimate destruction.
That is quite the journey. We started today looking at the intense physical reality of the cross.
We really did.
We navigated through the preacher's incredibly relatable, if slightly painful, physical woes with his toothache and digestion.
A very memorable detour.
And we arrived at this triumphant, unseen destruction of death itself.
It is a profound reminder that what we see with our physical eyes is never the whole story. The structural reality, the blueprint, is held securely in the unseen world.
So as we wrap up our time in the sermon, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over today.
Okay.
We've just established that the ultimate, most terrifying enemy humanity has ever faced, death itself, has already been completely dismantled and structurally defeated in the unseen world.
The biggest battle is already won.
Right. So if that is true, how much power are you currently giving to the much smaller everyday anxieties that are stressing you out in the visible world?
That's a great point.
If your eternal spirit is already entirely secure, how boldly, how freely could you choose to live your life tomorrow?
That is a question worth carrying with you all week.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us today as we spent time listening to today's sermon. Until next time, keep looking past the visible facade and stay curious.
Thank you for listening.